So yeah, just to kick off, I'll do very brief introduction. I've been a sign language interpreter for just shy of 20 years now. I graduated from Wolverhampton University in 2004, and then I went down to London to work as an in-house interpreter. And while I was working in-house, I also started the PG or postgraduate diploma with Sign Language International. That was under Peter Llewellyn-Jones at the time. And I finished that and I went freelance almost straight away, I think. And I've been freelance ever since. I moved back to Scotland in 2008, and I've worked pretty much in, kind of the range of sort of domains that interpreters work. I've done a lot, I used to do a lot in health. I do very little in health now. I've worked in, employment, training, conferences, so on and so forth. Most of my work now, post-pandemic, is with access to work clients, so working with people in their employment, also a local college. And I also do quite a bit of online work, but it's my own online work rather than through an agency. And in part, really, that's because it's because, I'll be honest, it's because of my menopause. I got to a point where I didn't like doing a lot of work that I used to enjoy doing. I don't really enjoy traveling as much anymore, just because I find it so exhausting. And so, yeah, it's really kind of, the pandemic forced me really to reevaluate exactly how I was working, and it threw into sharp focus for me that I was actually in menopause, because I'd been, with hindsight, in it for quite a while up until then, but I had no idea. And that then takes me on to the Masters at Queen Margaret University in Edinburgh, which I started in 2019. And I was then needing a topic to research for my dissertation. I had no idea what I was going to do, to be honest. I found myself a little bit kind of struggling to think what I wanted to research in terms of interpreting. And that was, again, I think, just related to a lot that was going on with me at the time. And then once I realised that I was having issues at work as a result of my menopause, I did think, is it just me? Surely it's not just me, but it might be interesting to find out if it is or if it isn't. And so that became the subject of my dissertation. I also now do some menopause awareness training for various groups. I've done it, and I'm also hoping to become a trainer for a company called Henpicked. And their mission is to make every employer in the UK menopause friendly. There's quite a lot of large employers in the UK that have signed up to their menopause friendly accreditation, but there's still a really, really long way to go. So just before we get started, I'll just say a little bit about this evening. So I know Pauline said it will be about an hour. It might actually be a little bit shorter than that. It's gone for an hour, this presentation. It's gone for a little bit less. If I speak too quickly, as us Scots tend to do, then please give me a nudge and say, slow down a bit. We've got plenty of time. And so, yeah, I'll speak for, sort of 45, 50 minutes-ish, I think. And then we'll have time for discussions afterwards, which would be great. I will ask just a couple of questions of you as we go through, and I would like you, if you wouldn't mind, just to put your replies in the chat bar, but you're under no obligation to do so. It's nothing personal. I'm not asking for any, sort of personal information, but if you don't feel comfortable taking part and putting things in the chat box, that's absolutely fine. So without further ado then, let's talk about menopause and the sign language interpreting profession. Oops. So over the course of the next wee while, this is what I'll go over: menopause and the profession. So I'll go over the key facts of menopause, and I appreciate that this might be familiar information for some of you, maybe even for a lot of you, I don't know, but I think it's still worth, just revisiting for those of you that already know it. And if you're not aware of menopause, then, and what it actually means, then it's important, I think, to have that sort of general knowledge to start with. We'll then go on and look at menopause and work, and I'll do that within the context of the UK. Obviously, my research has been situated here, and that's the kind of area that I know. But I do think there are probably parallels with yourself in Ireland, hopefully. But if not, that's certainly something that I would be interested to hear about as well. I'll then move on to what I found and its relevance to interpreters or not. And then, as we say, we'll have time for questions and comments and feedback at the end. So just before we get started, I'd like you to indulge me if you don't mind, and we'll do a little bit of word association. So when I say, and I'll also put on screen these words, if you don't mind, if you'd like to, please put in the chat the first word that comes into your head, okay? So, first of all, fish. Smell. Great, that's interesting. Certainly varied answers. Okay, second word, garden. Great. So no one's put in what my husband said last night, and he said, pain in the backside and hard work. But you all look like you enjoy your gardens. That's great. Okay, next word, holiday. Great. Lovely. Yeah, lots of good associations with holiday. How about menopause? So I just saw Trish, you're lucky. Done and dusted, she says. But so what's interesting is, and there's also Bertha, all good. Wow, you're very lucky then. But what's interesting is when I say menopause, more often than not, and I don't know if you notice this or not, but there's often a pause before. I mean, I do normally do this verbally, but there's normally some pause before somebody responds and says what it is to think about it. And quite often, if it's a personal thing, then it's because they maybe aren't having such a good experience of it. They're having a difficult time. Sometimes it's because people just don't know, they don't know what to say. And they're also concerned that if they say something and they say the wrong thing, that they're going to offend someone. And I really think, particularly when you're menopausal, it can feel a bit like this. It can feel like people are kind of looking at you, that they're judging you, that they are sometimes appalled by what they see in terms of, if for example, you're having a really visible hot flash, that they kind of record. I mean, I don't mean that these things are really necessarily overt. And I think quite often we think people are having quite a negative reaction, but it can feel like that. It can definitely feel difficult. And I really think it's important that we need to normalise menopause just generally and not necessarily see it as something negative, but rather just what it is. It's a time of transition that if people who are going to have it are lucky enough to age, because it is an age-related thing normally, then they're going to go through it. But with the right knowledge and support, then I think hopefully we can come through it better than a lot of people have so far. So, what is menopause exactly? And quite simply, the National Health Service says everyone who menstruates will go through menopause. Now, they've changed this definition relatively recently, because it used to say all women who menstruate will go through menopause. But of course, we know that it's not only women who menstruate, and therefore it's not only women who will go through menopause. So everyone includes cisgender women, some transgender men, some people who identify as non-binary and non-conforming. And I should say non-gender conforming. And that's something that we really should bear in mind, because it's not necessarily the case, obviously, that it's just women that are going to be going through menopause and just women that we encounter that will be going through menopause. But when we see that everyone who menstruates goes through menopause, it sounds really simple. And so you have to think, why the heck is it just so bound up in stigma? And, why are people so unfamiliar with it? Why do people not know what's involved? Because surely, that's just easy, isn't it? But often the way that we speak about menopause is very sweeping. And I think, therefore, it's very misleading. And I think that statement, just we'll go through menopause, I think that's misleading as well. Because what does it actually mean? Well, so the average age for menopause is 51 years, but it literally means that periods will stop, so menstruation will stop, and then obviously it's the end of the person's reproductive years. And it's a bizarre thing, if you like, a medical thing, because it can only be confirmed retrospectively. Actual menopause is confirmed retrospectively, and it is, as I say, 12 months after the last menstrual cycle. If menopause is just one day, though, again, we might be thinking, what's the big deal? It's one day, surely it's not that big a thing. But before that day of menopause, of course, is the phase known as, phase known as perimenopause. And it's during this time that the hormones that are produced by the ovaries, they stop being produced. So that's estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. They start to decrease. And eventually they get to such low levels then that the person reaches menopause. Perimenopause usually starts in the mid-40s and then continues up until that day of menopause. The person can actually have sort of false stops and starts along the way. This is not linear. Perimenopause is not a linear thing leading up to then that day of menopause. So quite often a person might miss their period for 3 months, 4 months, 6 months, 11 months, and then they get a period and they're right back then to month 1, if you like. So they then have to start counting that again up to 12 months before they reach menopause. But then after that day, after they've reached menopause, they're postmenopausal for the rest of their life. And if you think back to, for example, the late 1800s or early 1900s, women would have their menopause at that time they'd be around 57 years old. But then their life expectancy was only a few years sort of beyond that. And so it was quite soon afterwards, which meant that menopause was really an end of life event. It wasn't just the end of your reproductive years, but it was, for women, it was the end of your life. Nowadays, of course, people are having their menopause earlier, but they're also living much longer, well into their 80s. And so they're living almost a third of their life now, postmenopausally. And I think that's another reason why we really have to understand exactly what it is, what's going on, and see it for what it is, that it's not the end of, or it is obviously at the end of something, but it doesn't have to be a terrible event in a person's life. So with a natural menopause, it usually, as I say, happens when a person's around 50. But it can actually happen earlier than that. You can have an early menopause, which happens between age 40 and 45, again, a natural menopause. You can have a premature menopause, which happens for about 1 in 100 people. and that's below the age of 40. And that's usually when there's a condition with the ovaries that means that they're not producing eggs, they're not producing follicles, and that puts them into a premature menopause. But in reality, I mean, you can see from that, you can really go into menopause at any time, or you can have menopause at any time. It's not just a midlife. It's typically a midlife event, but it doesn't have to be. And that's something else that we should bear in mind, is that you just don't know who might be experiencing menopausal symptoms at any stage in their life, and who may need support to go through it. The other thing to bear in mind is that some people will have what's known as a medically induced menopause. And that's due to, treatments like hysterectomy. Also, some cancer treatments can put someone into menopause. And when this happens, so I said before about the perimenopause stage, which is when, symptoms will start and they'll start to experience that and they'll lead up to the menopause. When a person has a surgical or a medical menopause, it is quite literally like a cliff edge. So they're put into menopause literally overnight. There's no lead up to it. And quite often they'll experience a whole barrage of symptoms, very, very shortly thereafter. So that's another menopause that we can have, the surgical medical menopause. In the UK, the reality of menopause and what it entails has not been discussed openly. It is starting to change now, and I'll come on to that a little bit later as to why that is, but it hasn't been included in our school curriculums. It's not been spoken about in families or friends groups, or it has been spoken about in very closed groups. And the stigma and shame that's surrounded it has continued for a long time. And I think quite often as well, people, when you're younger, I know for myself, it was something, I knew about it, but I never thought about it. Why would I? It wasn't going to happen to me for such a long time. It just seemed like such a long way away that you don't think you need to think about it. But I think quite often as well, for people who it's imminent for, it's coming very soon, quite possibly, but because there is still this lack of education and awareness about it, quite often people don't actually realise that they're already in perimenopause until they have been for some time, and something happens that then brings that to light. Something makes them realise something's not right, but they don't quite know what it is. But as a result of that, only 50% of people will go and see their GP. And typically it's because something's happened. They can no longer cope with whatever it is, or they think something's really, they think something's really quite wrong with them. They think there's something wrong that is not menopause related. 77% of people don't realise that symptoms are menopausal. And we'll come on to symptoms because there are quite a lot of them. So, yeah. So that's what I've just spoken about, is very much the biological and medical model of menopause. We can't get away from it. Okay, there are physiological changes that are taking place that you just, they're normal. We're not going to get away from it. But the menopause transition takes place within the person, experiences it within the society and within the culture that they are. And so it's been described also as a socio-cultural phenomenon as well in experience. And that view takes the view that, yes, of course, the person is experiencing the menopause, of course they are, but situated within the place, within the community, within the society that they're in. And it's a way to normalise menopause. It takes it more of a positive view of menopause. It takes more of a supportive view of menopause. It sees menopause as something that affects everyone, and it helps reduce the stigma and shame that's associated with it. And when I say, it sees menopause as something that affects everyone, I think that's really important. It's something that we really need to bear in mind, because everyone knows someone who menstruates. And that means that everyone knows someone who will experience menopause if they're not already. And that could be a mother, a sister, a wife, a partner. It could be the person that serves you your coffee in the morning. You know, I mean, it is literally 50% or more, even 51% of the population. The thing to remember, though, is although everyone who experiences menopause ultimately experiences the same thing, which is their period stops, so their periods stop, the lead up to that can be very different. And two people can have what, you know, on paper are the same symptoms, but how they experience them are very different and they don't have the same effect on them. And that's why it's important that we also remember that menopause is always personal. But this brings us nicely on to symptoms. So my next question for you, if you wouldn't mind popping in the chat box, is how many symptoms of menopause are there, do you think? Type me a number. One million. So there's quite a big range there. But the reality is we don't know. There is no definitive number of how many symptoms there are. Some sources list 10, some say that there are over 40. There are certainly, I mean, on this slide alone, there are over 40 on this slide. I'm not going to go through them. You know, there's just too many. But there are certainly a lot of symptoms that are associated with menopause that I think a lot of people don't realise are associated with menopause. Particularly, you know, some of the more, well, I'm good to say unusual. I think unusual just because we didn't know about them. So, for example, people say that they have a burning tongue, or there's this thing called electric shock syndrome, which I had never heard of before. And I think in part that's the thing. You know, a lot of people will say, well, is it a menopause symptom or is it an age symptom? And to be honest, my response to that is, does it matter? Menopause is part of me personally aging. So I think it's a moot point if it's menopause age. It's around that time. It's happening at a menopause stage. I don't think you can separate the two. So the important thing as well to remember about symptoms is I mentioned that they start normally in perimenopause, and they're not linear. So someone might experience some symptoms sometimes and then other symptoms other times. They might experience a lot of symptoms at the same time. The symptoms, it can be the same symptom, but it can be better or it can be worse. It can fluctuate. And for some people as well, they'll continue to experience symptoms after menopause. So it's not a case of, you know, you have the symptoms during perimenopause, reach menopause, and then that's it. They do typically taper off maybe a year, 2 years, 3 years after menopause, but some people will have symptoms for the rest of their lives. And, you know, something like, for example, if I just talk about vaginal atrophy, that's not something, it can be treated, but if it's not treated, that's not something that's going to fix itself after menopause. So that's a symptom that will continue after menopause. So it's, and you know, in joint and muscle pain, that's another one that quite often that will continue after menopause. So yes, some of them will taper off and will resolve themselves, for want of a better word. But a lot of them will continue or can continue after menopause. When we think about the symptoms, the severity really changes from person to person, as I said. And it's been reported, though, that 1 in 5 people will have no or mild symptoms. And that's, you know, fair play to them. I think it sounds great. So yeah, 1 in 5, no or mild symptoms. They might experience a hot flash. More often than not, they'll notice that their periods have changed, and they'll have mild symptoms, but they typically won't last for long. So they'll have quite a short perimenopause, and then they'll have their menopause, and then that's pretty much it. The other 4 in 5 will have what's classed as bothersome symptoms. And there's an author of a report that I referred to very briefly later on that was done for the British government. I saw her speaking about menopause, and she spoke about these bothersome symptoms. And she says, and I really liked this because she says, bothersome. I've really thought of that. It's almost like there's a fly buzzing about and it's bothering you, and you can buzz it away. And she says, it's like we can just bat our symptoms away. What nonsense. But this is the official definition, if you like, certainly a working definition just now, that people will have bothersome symptoms. And they can have some impact on their lives. Certainly they can, for example, they're very aware of the fact that they're having the symptoms. So it's not kind of something that's very low key, it's something that they're quite very aware of. Out of those 4, one person will have symptoms that are debilitating enough that they'll really significantly impact all areas of their lives. And again, quite often, because the symptoms typically don't happen in isolation, it's the kind of build-up of symptoms that leads to this sort of to them being debilitating. But often by the time it gets there, they're almost at crisis point because they haven't realised exactly what's going on beforehand. How this can manifest itself, for example, excuse me, a person might have night sweats. And that can be horrific in and of itself. They can't get a decent sleep. They're waking up sometimes 3 or 4 times a night, drenched in sweat. But it then means that, as I said, they're not sleeping. They'll wake up the next day severely fatigued. Then they maybe have to go to work and they have difficulty concentrating. And that can really result in a loss of confidence at their work. It could also be that, when they're at work, they're having hot flushes and they have to stand up and give a presentation, or not. They could just be sitting at a desk surrounded by colleagues or with colleagues and they have a hot flush. Again, that can lead to difficulty concentrating. I mean, people literally describe hot flushes as being like a furnace that comes out of nowhere. That can also, in some cases, then lead to memory recall and lapses. And people have described this sometimes as thinking that they're getting early onset dementia. So they get really worried about what's happening. But again, it's often not until these things have sort of built up and they get to almost a crisis point that they then go and seek help and information about what it is that's going on. And normally I have to say the first port of call is Google. Yeah, and again, so then this then can lead to a loss of confidence. So menopause, the thing about it in menopause and perimenopause is that it doesn't happen in isolation. We can't just say, get back to me in 5 years, get back to me in 10 years, however long it's going to take. People who are going through the perimenopause and then, menopause, they have other commitments. They have family. They might have young children at home because a lot of women and a lot of people are having families later. But they might also have teenagers at home. One of the participants in my research had teenagers at home, and she said, between her going through perimenopause and the teenagers going through puberty, she said it was just like a maelstrom at times. She said it was just horrific, but actually also really good because everybody kind of knew what was going on with everybody else. But yeah, so there can be children at home. They have the home often to look after. I mean, the fact of the matter is, it is mostly women that still go through menopause, and it is mostly women that still have responsibilities for example, family, the home, and so on. Also, elder care. Quite often they'll now have elderly parents that they're responsible for. And there is also, of course, work. More women than ever now are working, and they're working during their period of perimenopause and menopause, which means that that's something else that they're having to manage. And so work's where we'll go to next. So why are we talking about it now, particularly in Britain? Again, I said that I would place this into the UK context. And really what's happened is we've had a political, media and social kind of phenomenon. It's just combined to create what is almost just like the perfect scenario, the perfect time to talk about this. Quite often these things happen for political and business reasons, right? And quite often you just need the right person in the right place at the right time. Political and business, quite often it's about economics as well. And that's exactly what happened in 2017. It was 2016. The UK government commissioned researchers at the University of Leicester to look into, as it says here, the effects of menopause transition on women's economic participation in the UK. And it's because that women in the sort of perimenopause age group are the fastest growing group of workers in the UK workforce. And a lot of them are working later. They have no choice because of changes to pensions. A lot of them maybe took time out to have their families. So some of them haven't built up pension pots that they might otherwise have done, that younger generations probably will do. There's also a cost of living crisis in the UK at the moment. So there's more pressures on people to work, for example. But as a result of lots that were going on politically, the government commissioned this report, and it showed definitively that menopause was having a substantial impact for a significant number of women when at work. The next thing that happened was the government, as a result of that report, the Women and Equalities Committee was established. And they've got a whole remit of work, but part of it was to look at menopause in the workplace. And so last year, they published their first report. They heard from a whole range of people. So they heard from researchers, they heard from policy makers, they heard from people who campaign on women's rights. They heard from women who had experiences of menopause in the workplace themselves. They heard from a whole range of people and took evidence from them. But they published a report last year, and they had several recommendations in that. One of them was to make menopause a protected characteristic under the Equalities Act 2010, and the government refused to do it. They've said that they don't think it would be beneficial, certainly at the moment. They've not ruled out revisiting it in the future, but they think for now that it should be employers' responsibility to see how they can support their employees in the workplace. So that was a little bit disappointing. But the other thing that happened in terms of menopause is it's now started to be named in, for example, this is the Scottish Government's Women's Health Plan. And again, it comes down to having the right people in the right place at the right time. So our previous First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, she's spoken quite openly about her menopause and experiencing it while at work. And a lot of the female MSPs in the Scottish Parliament are about that same age. So I think all it needs is, as I say, to have people with an interest in something to start getting this on the agenda, so to speak. So menopause is mentioned in the Women's Health Plan. Similarly, in England, again, this came this was in relation to the Women's Inequalities Committee. Sorry, they'd also mentioned. So in Britain, the health is a devolved matter. So in Scotland, for example, we don't pay for prescription charges. We don't pay prescription charges, I should say. In England, they do. And something that people really complained bitterly about in England was if they were on HRT, if they wanted HRT, was the cost of it made it quite prohibitive for people. And so one of the things that the government did in England was that they have made it so there's a ceiling on how much a person can be charged for HRT in 1 year. So again, that's getting in the health strategy. So there are things that are happening, little bits, that hopefully all these little bits will add up to big bits. Wales, they've just published, well, it was January last year, but they were the last government or the last government so far to publish their, in this instance, so they talk about menopause again, but it's in relation to health that they've published. But we also have businesses and campaigners who are really sort of putting menopause on the map and saying that employers need to be thinking about this. If people leave work, I've come on to this, but if people leave work because of their menopause, it costs an employer something in the region of £30,000 to replace them, because they have to go through the process, obviously, of finding a replacement, training them, so on and so forth. So it's beneficial to employers to keep people in the workforce if they can. And this is another one. And this was actually the most recent study that I'm aware of. This was one of the largest studies that was done. And this was actually in relation to, I don't know if you're aware of it or not, but the Davina McCall did a programme for Channel 4 here in the UK. I think that'll be 2 years ago now. This was a survey that was done in collaboration with that. And this, the cohort in this was, I think it's about 3,500 people, which is one of the biggest surveys that has been done. And a general survey, because quite often what happens is research that's been published previously, it's been with a very specific group of people. So, for example, there was a report out in, let me say, 2019 that was done with people working in the police force. It's very specific. This was much more general. And again, though, it highlighted that people are struggling, or many people are struggling with their menopause in the workplace. But I think this is really the crux of what's happening here, is that we have Gen X campaigners, and I use campaigners in the sort of broadest term here. But as I mentioned, we've got Nicola Sturgeon, we've got people like Davina McCall, Carolyn Harris up there, who's an MP. You have to forgive me because I don't know how to pronounce it. Is it Grania? But you have people in Ireland as well who are now speaking out about this. And in part, I think these are the people who have benefited from changes in maternity provision and who are now getting a bit older and saying, well, hold on a minute, what is there for us now at our stage in life? We're working, we're doing this, and they're rightly now, really kind of influencing change and influencing social change. And you do need people like this to speak out, because, like it or not, governments don't tend to listen to people like us. So, the most problematic symptoms at work. Are there problematic symptoms that people at work? I'm going to ask you just to take to the chat again and pop in there what you think would be the most problematic symptoms that people are experiencing in relation to their work. Yeah, great. I mean, you're spot on. Everything that you're putting in there, you're absolutely spot on. There you go. I think you've pretty much covered it all. Yeah. So, I mean, hot flushes tend to be the sort of stereotypical, oh, is it hot in here? And I must admit, when I thought up the title of the talk, it was a bit of I was trying to mislead you a little bit, if I'm honest. But a lot of people think, oh, menopause, it's related to hot flushes. But you're right, actually. A lot of the symptoms that are really affecting people at work are things like, for example, tiredness and difficulty sleeping, because that then has a knock-on effect the next day. Brain fog, difficulty concentrating, which makes work that they've done really quite easily before, the tasks just become cumbersome. They take twice as long. A lot of people actually end up feeling paranoid and anxious that their managers and colleagues think that they're not up to scratch anymore, think that they're not up to the job. A lot of people can experience anxiety that they haven't experienced before. And also, yeah, joint pain and stiffness. And I must admit, so joint pain and stiffness, that was actually one of my early symptoms. So that was probably, if I think about it, that was back in about 2013 or 15, and I had no clue. And I didn't do anything about it because my brother had recently been diagnosed with arthritis in his hips. And I was damned if I was going to go to the doctor and be diagnosed with arthritis at 43 years old. And with hindsight, I mean, it was like, yeah, it was my first symptom that I was aware of anyway. Now, so what can be done then, though? Sorry, before we go on to that, what are people doing as a result of experiencing their symptoms? Well, you can see here. So 14% are reducing their hours or they're working part-time, choosing to work part-time. 25% have considered leaving work. That's 1 in 4 people have considered leaving work. 10% are actually leaving work. And I mean, that's, when you think about it, certainly, in relation to the UK workforce, it's over 300,000 women have left work as a result of their menopause. And actually, these are only the people that we know about. These are only the people that have responded to questionnaires or who've responded to research calls for participants in research projects. So what can be done then? What can be done to support people? Well, employers can support their employees in various ways. They can really work to change the culture of the organisation. For example, they can put menopause policies in place. They can provide training for managers, because a lot of people, when they realise that they need support, they won't approach their managers. In part, it's because managers are often men and they don't want to approach a male. Quite often managers are younger than them and male, but even just if they're younger females, they feel it's awkward, it's difficult to approach their manager. So training for managers is something else they can provide. Providing things like fans or being able to, control the temperature in a room, get some ventilation, make sure they have clean water, clean and comfortable toilet facilities. If they wear uniforms, making sure that they're breathable fabric. And also just pointing people in the right direction for support and advice. So this is all great. I know I'm waffling on a bit here. You're probably thinking, oh, when is she actually going to get to something that's relevant to us? Here we go. Is it relevant to us? So this is from the CISLI census done with interpreters working in the UK in 2021. And it confirmed pretty much what we all know. The majority of the profession is female. But it also showed that 33% are aged 45 to 55, and that is the menopausal age band, if you like. It also showed, if you see the pie chart off to the right there, that almost 50% of the profession are younger, which means that assuming they stay in interpreting, they're all going to experience their menopause while they're working. Around 85% are also self-employed. And that means it's great that the government have said employers should be doing more, employers should be supporting people. But what about interpreters who are self-employed? Who's supporting them? So that led me to my research. Obviously, I needed a database. I needed to gather some evidence. So I put out a call for participants. I had about 18 people responded. In the end, 12 interpreters took part. And I held semi-structured group discussions. They were held on Zoom, so the groups were quite small to make sure that there was enough time for people to contribute and for discussions. Each lasted between an hour and 2 hours. Everybody was asked to self-identify as being either peri or post-menopausal, and also they had to be registered or regulated trainees with one of the organisations in the UK. 9 interpreters were self-employed. 3 were employed at least on a part-time basis, and that's broadly consistent with the CISLI findings for employment as well. So yeah, they generated a lot of data. But the symptoms that were affecting them at work then, you can see here. Again, I won't read them out, but the eagle-eyed amongst you will see that they correlate with the symptoms that are affecting the other people that took part in the other studies in their workplace. So interpreters are experiencing these same symptoms. Through the findings, I've managed to identify these 3 themes. So I had a thematic analysis and I've identified these 3 themes. So they're feeling unprepared, they're managing different responsibilities at one time, and then they're finding ways to cope. Almost everyone said that they hadn't been prepared for menopause. They hadn't seen it coming, they had no idea what to expect. Some people, though, said that their symptoms were mild and manageable, and even though they hadn't known what to expect and hadn't been prepared, actually it didn't cause them any issues. You can see here, these are just snapshots of some of the quotes, and Carol had said, I should point out actually that these are all pseudonyms, so these are not the participants' real names, but Carol had said, wasn't massively tricky, there were a few issues, but nothing too bad. The majority, though, said that their menopause had affected their work. And some people had said that they'd actually experienced really quite rapid changes in things like eyesight. They developed tinnitus. They also, mostly though, reported the psychological symptoms as being difficult. So, for example, oh, sorry, bear with me. Here. I'll read Anna's quote in full. So Anna had said, I just find that my processing isn't as slick as it was. And again, that's connected to the brain fog and the tiredness and the lack of sleep for me, certainly. And it's a clunky kind of processing that I'm going through. And I'm finding that in itself really tiring. They're constantly searching for the kind of lexicon all the time. And that really shows then how the symptoms that she'd experienced the night before were affecting her the next day. Heather, she actually spoke about something similar, but she was talking about how symptoms that were happening at work were affecting her. And so she said, I was working in an office and I found answering the phone, the unpredictability of what might happen, meetings that you're going to suddenly, that you don't know about, that brought on anxiety. And then there's this part of my chin here, she said, and she pointed under her chin, and she said, would just drip, and like proper drip. And then that would make me feel flustered. And obviously then you don't look as confident, do you? And so we can see that colleagues are having to manage not only, the interpreting task, but they are having to manage menopause symptoms on top, additional stresses. And we can start to see then as well that it is, if you're unprepared for it, it is going to have an impact on your work. In terms of managing their sort of coexisting responsibilities, I said, you know, a lot of people at that time, they have other things that they're dealing with. Betty here, she'd said, you know, at this age in our life, this stage in our life, we're already managing a lot. Children, potentially elderly parents, work. There's a lot going on and it can be quite a challenge. But again, I come back to Anna again, and she was saying, you know, she was talking about how one of the responsibilities we have are our clients, not just work for our sake, but because of the community that we work with. And she was talking about, this was the impact of, or this was about her going to work the day after she'd had a particularly bad night. And she said, on the drive home, I've thought, well, that wasn't, not that there's been any complaints or any issues, but in myself and evaluating and reflecting on the job, thinking, actually, I wasn't up to the mark today, not to what I should have been doing. Yeah. But self-care is something that I think I struggle with. But there's also, and she goes on to say this, it's a difficult part of being a freelancer too, because she can't afford to take time off work, but she also doesn't want to let the client down. So it's really difficult. The last quote I'll speak to on this slide here, this was Lorna, and she was talking about, you know, when you're working and if your menopause symptoms are impacting you, and you're aware of it, she's saying, oh, she wouldn't ask for a break because she was saying, we're not there as us. If we take a break, that has implications for the people who are actually doing stuff, and we're intruding upon somebody else. She says, if I needed a break because I've done it before when I've been interpreting, I'm aware my processing is deteriorating because I've been working for too long, I'll ask for a break. But I don't think menopause would be the reason to ask for a break. Okay, so what are they doing then to ease the load? Catherine, really at the top there, she summed it up and she says, we can't ask for things that other people can ask for, can we? She says, employed people, we can't ask for that. But I mentioned, you know, some people, the symptoms are quite minor, if you like, or not minor, that's not right to say that. They're not bothersome. So Carol, for example, she said that she would develop an unpleasant sheen, and it was embarrassing and uncomfortable, but she could carry on working and then sort of damp herself down, tidy herself up afterwards, and then just carry on. People are also taking practical measures, wearing layers, drinking cool drinks, using desk fans. So Betty spoke to that, and she said that she will quite often take a little desk fan with her, depending on where she is. If she's familiar with the setting, she'll say, I'm with the client, she'll say, you don't mind if I put this on the desk, do you? So she's doing things like that. And also, yeah, a lot of people were saying that they know where all the toilets are now on their commute to work. Can I just get a check on time, please?
Actually, this is Pauline speaking. It's nearly 8 o'clock. I was nearly going to interrupt you.
Okay, I've not got too much left to do.
Okay, we'll wait for that then.
Okay, cool.
Thank you.
Okay, so on this slide then, I'll actually just skip to Ethel. Well, actually, let me just say, so Natalie was saying, you know, she was really disappointed because at the time that she'd gone through a menopause, she was working in an agency and it was female led. And she had said she was really disappointed because people were really unsupportive. And she said, you know, we need to get to a point where we are supportive of each other. And it's about awareness, really. If I just mention Ethel here, though, she had said very experienced interpreter, a very, very experienced interpreter. And she had said, there's a lot of work. I'm very careful about what I'm taking now. It's a real shame because we're all people with great life experience and work experience, and we're ideally positioned to provide a good service for the deaf community. And yet we're going, I don't know if I can do it. And so just to wrap up then, I'm getting on to my conclusion and my implications then. I think for interpreters, we do need to be thinking ahead. The interpreting profession, or the interpreters individually, and I'll come on to the profession, we really do need to be thinking ahead and preparing for this, particularly given that there's, there doesn't seem to be any likelihood that how we get work is going to change anytime soon. Certainly in the UK, I can't speak for Ireland. I really can't see people going back to being in-house interpreters in huge numbers anytime soon. They need to know that they can get support. And I wonder if they also need to be able to negotiate working arrangements. A lot of there's obviously a lot of settings where we might not be able to be entirely flexible, or the people that we're working with might not be able to. But I think COVID has shown that actually we can, in some settings, in some situations, be flexible. If it's someone that they're working with regularly, maybe in an access to work settings, an employment setting, it could be that they have that conversation and say, some days actually I might need to work from home. Would that be okay? It might work, it might not. But I think certainly we need to be having these conversations. And that then does bring me on to our clients, all clients, but particularly deaf clients. If I think even though it might be a relatively small number of interpreters who are changing their working patterns, but even so, in a small profession, that can have a very big impact, especially when they're working in specialist settings, or if they've been working with people for a long time. Clients are going to lose skilled workers, lose skilled interpreters. It could be that it's entirely ethical for the interpreter not to work in that area any longer. But again, I think it comes down to having that conversation and making ourselves a little bit vulnerable and speaking to people about it. Maybe as awareness increases and our clients are more aware of the menopause and what's involved in it, then there might be that room for some more negotiation and, as I say, finding suitable working strategies. And then lastly, for the profession, again, it's important to say that not all interpreters who go through menopause will have a negative experience and have a bad transition, or a difficult transition, but some will. And I do think, we need to have support and possibly signposting, excuse me, from professional organisations and awareness training. I think that might go a long way to supporting interpreters through it. Just to say, last word, is that none of the participants in this study, in my research, had considered giving up interpreting entirely, although a lot of them had changed their working practices. But I would just caveat that by saying, we don't know how many have already changed their working practices. We don't know how many have already left. And so I think that's something that we really do need to be mindful of. And I think, I've just repeated these slides, so that's us. Oh gosh, and again. There we go, my references, that's us. Thank you for listening. I hope that was interesting. Hope you got something out of it.